You're listening to Beyond Boss Fights, gaming conversations with interesting people. And now, here's your host, Raxwolf.
Hello, and welcome to episode 9 of Beyond Boss Fights. Thank you for joining us. Today, I have Andrew, who is better known in gaming communities as DJPimpDaddy. He's on the show to talk about what happens when a gaming community dies. Communities are such a large part of gaming nowadays. In fact, of my 9 podcast episodes, 3 have revolved around gaming communities in some way. A few weeks ago, I wrote a blog post called Too Big to Succeed, which talked about the difficulty of an individual maintaining a podcast or blog as it continues to grow in popularity. But when Andrew read that post, he contacted me directly and asked if I'd like to do a quote-unquote sad show about what it's like when a gaming community dies or falls apart for whatever reason. And he has kind of a unique inside perspective on this topic because he's been a major driving force behind not one, but 2 very popular communities, each of which has eventually dissolved away. Now, during the course of this conversation, Andrew and I examine the rise and fall of these 2 communities. We take advantage of hindsight and discuss whether this type of downfall can be avoided. Today we have special guest, interesting person, DJPimpDaddy, who is actually going by Andrew now, at least on this podcast, and maybe into the future. We'll see. DJPimpDaddy was a moniker that he used for several gaming personas that he's had, and has kind of stuck with him through social media and things like that. So that's probably how you know him. But we're gonna be a little more formal and go with his real name tonight.
Well, I mean, in the age of Gmail, yeah, how hard it would be to get rid of such a fantastic name on Gmail. I mean, really. You can't get any good names.
No, not anymore. You could do DJPimpDaddy 95362 or something like that.
I've met that guy.
Go back to the AOL days of naming your email. The reason Andrew is on tonight is because we've talked a couple times in previous podcasts about what happens when your community, blog, podcast, what have you, gets too big to be financially viable. And we ran into this with Contains Moderate Peril a few months ago. Luckily, he was able to procure a sponsor that was able to help him save his podcast. But this doesn't always work out for people. And one of the things that Andrew reached out to me about during that time frame was, hey, I've got some experience with this. Would you like to talk about it? And we bounced some ideas back and forth. So that's why he's on tonight. We're going to go into a couple of communities that Andrew's been involved in that didn't work out quite so well in the end. But before we get into that, Andrew, could you give us your definitive gaming history? I know it's fairly extensive. You don't have to go through all the games that were in your closet if you don't want to.
I will hit the high points, okay?
Yeah.
Started back when I think my dad brought home this Magnavoxy thing. I cannot remember what it was because we were little kids, but it was like a light gun and he played Pong on it. It was fantastic. And then, of course, we were early adopters of the TI 99 4A home computer. Loved me some Hunt the Wampus and Parsec.
Okay.
That's a throwback for you guys. Back when you had to load stuff from tape. It was great back then.
I do remember that.
Do that. That was fantastic days. And then, of course, we got I was the second kid on the block that got a Nintendo Entertainment System. And that's sort of like when life changed because it was all downhill from there. We all went from skinny little kids running around the neighborhood to we played Mario late into the night or Contra or whatever. You just kept replaying the same games all the time. And then, of course, we did the Super Nintendo, the 64. God, I went all the way through. I gave up on Nintendo at the Nintendo 64. And then at that point, I think I went into PC gaming for a while. That was like the Baldur's Gate days, like the first version of what's it called? Now it doesn't matter. Those days, the high RPG days that are now classic games on GOG. And then, of course, I think I got back into console gaming on the PlayStation 2, and I did the PlayStation 3, and it was Skyrim on the PlayStation 3 that actually drove me mad with all its bugs. And that was the first game I bought on Steam, and after that, I've completely given up all my consoles. Now, I still do collect Nintendo games, but I just don't play them anymore. And of course, as we'll probably hear in the next hour or 5, done some extensive Steam gaming, and I had a bout where I got over an addiction of Minecraft, and my one and only MMO is actually Lotro, if you could believe that. So,
yeah, and that's really not all that uncommon for Lotro players. There's a lot of people that have only played that game.
Oh, certainly.
And that's actually how we probably became familiar with each other, was tweeting about Lotro back and forth.
Yeah. It brings us all together. See, Tolkien was a great guy.
His legacy endures.
Yes.
You talked about your obsession with Minecraft. Now, I know you were involved in what didn't start out to be a community, did it? But it was called This Week in Minecraft. What was that?
This Week in Minecraft was formed by a guy named Brad, who I think his online screen name was like Brad as something 74 in Minecraft. But everybody knew him as Brad. He was one of the first people I saw when I found Minecraft. Instantly fell in love with the game because I have a long history of just loving and playing with Legos. Even now, I have some Legos on my desk, and I'm proud to say that. But Brad was one of those early YouTubers of Minecraft before the huge wave of Minecraft videos just flooded the internet. And I remember commenting a bunch on some of his videos, and he ended up telling that he was starting his own server, because that was like a new thing back then. They finally came out with the software to do a server versus just playing locally. And at the time, he had asked if I had any experience with like Linux or running a server, and I said sure, I'll help out a little bit. And it went from me helping him out and playing on a server to within a month, I was, an admin on his this Week in Minecraft, server. And then I realized that as Minecraft took off, his popularity kept rising and rising, and as a result, people were just flooding onto the server. And then at the time, I had started falling in love with podcasting on iTunes. Being an Apple guy, you're just like, oh, sweet podcast. And I kept thinking, I was like, I wouldn't mind doing a show about Minecraft. So I proposed to Brad. I'm like, hey, would you mind doing an audio podcast about our server and the whole, some of your ideas you talk about in your videos, etc. And of course he was okay with the idea. He loved it. So we called it the Twimcast, because it was This Week in Minecraft. Everyone kept calling it the Twim server. And as soon as we started the Twimcast, I did it on a Mumble chat channel that we had rented. And we had at first we had a 15 user limit. And by the second or third week, we realized we were running out of chat channels. So we either had to bump people off just to start to do the show, or we increased it to 25 users, which, was another financial, cost, because he's already paying for hosting at the time for the server. And the show ended up exploding over just like the first 10 episodes, because we had everybody that was playing on his server, which was already, a couple hundred people. And then we had a vacuum of good shows in iTunes. So when people started looking at the podcasts and they said, oh, This Week in Minecraft, that must be a good show. Our ratings at the time just spiked way up. And it turned into the point where every weekend we had a 25 user, live show that we consistently did every weekend as best as we could. And we I couldn't get into our own show. I'd have to boot somebody out of the chat channel just to log in to be able to do the show. But from the very beginning, one of the things I thought was fantastic was just the ability to do a live show and be able to let audience members, we could unmute them and let them speak. And I thought that was a fantastic, I wouldn't say gimmick, but I thought that was a thing that our show did perfectly, because back in the day, a lot of these shows, this is pre-Twitch, or pre-Google Hangouts, a lot of the podcasts that were out there were all, a bunch of people talking over Skype or something. It was a one-way show. There's really no interaction with an audience unless it was through comments or feedback or whatever. So, yeah, we instantaneously were hit with the Minecraft crowd. And it's like, that's where, as we sort of peaked in our popularity, that's where I started seeing, all these hidden costs and hidden obligations with, two guys basically running a podcast and trying to do a show and trying to do, a community at the same time. Because at its peak, we peaked at number 3 on the iTunes store for Minecraft podcasts. We were beat out by like big shows like The Shaft, if you've ever heard of them. Great guys, but it's like those guys have like an actual production company sort of backing them up. And then Brad he's like some guy who works in warehousing in Arizona. And, at the time I was an entry-level IT guy working out of my basement, so.
Yeah, well, this is really not that much different than what we talk about in the gaming podcast community too, because it seems like the folks who are either part of a network or have this type of backing do fine. And even though it seems like podcasting has a very low barrier to entry, once you get to a certain point, it gets a lot more difficult at a certain point in popularity.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what creates a challenge for actually making the step to the next level. And you guys found this out with This Week in Minecraft. When you were at your peak, how were you guys feeling about that? Were you thinking about taking a next step, or did you have some kind of plan you were putting in place, or were you just saying, boy, let's just ride this as long as we can and see where it takes us?
Honestly, we were half, flabbergasted at, the numbers. And then the other half of us was so busy doing tasks, doing almost a job to sort of support this hobby that we're just bleeding money, because I mean, we assumed that like 75% of our crowd was probably under the age of 18. So we felt very weird about asking for donations, from like kids, because we were one of the few censored Minecraft podcasts. When you looked on the iTunes store, like all of them were just, explicit, flagged, except for ours. So we always kept our show PG. And as a result, like we were the one that everyone downloaded. So, I can't complain about that. But yeah, it's like when I think at the peak, if I remember correctly, we kept adding, it was like 20 to 40, maybe sometimes 50 users a day to a manual whitelist on our Minecraft server. And then we had an army of people that were basically, in-game moderators, basically banning and, messing with griefers. That was something you never even thought about until the game Minecraft came out. I never even realized the concept of griefing until that game came out. And then I was also running the website and the forums, and our forums were excellent. You could log in, and within an hour, there was like 10 or 15 new topics. And then, of course, we had the show, the podcast, which I did all the technical, and I led the show, because Brad was busy with the server. And with that, we're talking like maybe 6 or 10 hours a week of, coming up with content or editing. And I learned a lot of hard lessons about recording with editing in mind. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure you have the same thing where you don't want to have to go back and edit just because it's so time consuming. It's almost like twice the amount of effort it takes to edit like 1 minute of actual in content.
Well, notice this show is only once a month.
There you go. That's fantastic. So it became a job. And I think with his band, I had heard that he was paying about $150 a month just in bandwidth from the data center that was running the server. And the servers, the server that we had, because the whole podcast centered around the Minecraft server, the server was so full that we had exceeded every single class of game server hosting. And in the end, he actually purchased 2 pieces of hardware that he basically, failed over between the 2 of them. And we were paying this data center in Arizona to basically host these 2 pieces of hardware that he actually purchased for a $20 game, mind you. This all started with a $20 game. So,
and you don't exactly have a business plan because this is a hobby to you.
Exactly. And it really took off when my wife noticed that I wasn't happy playing the game. Like when I logged in, I was logging in to do work. I was logging in to chase down a moderator that was banning a griefer or something, and it seriously did. It was not a game that I enjoyed playing anymore. And then also at that point, Minecraft had started to reach the end where it was about to be publicly released, in the final version. And at that point, there wasn't a lot of big additions. So like a news show was just pointless. So every episode we had was more around the comedy and our great, our fantastic audience. But in the end, it was like, it was on episode 25 that's when I actually announced to everybody, including Brad, that was going to be my last show. And as soon as I said that, it was like a death nail on the show because everybody was just bummed out. The last 15 minutes of that episode was it was like the sinking of the Titanic. People were just crying and the music was, it was terrible. Yeah. It was very awkward. And, we had assembled, not guest hosts, but we had, secondary hosts, I guess you would say. Brad and I were always on the show, and I led the show, and Brad was like, my comedic sidekick, so to speak. But then, we had Linux for Life, which was one of our server admins that helped out. And then we also had another man, J Minman, I think, that was his handle. Don't want to give his real name if he doesn't want me to. And both of them were just speechless. And it was that exact week that I had started talking with Scott Viper about the other podcast idea that we'll talk about in a few minutes. But it was just bad timing because I really hope people didn't think I was just ditching Minecraft to do the other show. But at the same time, like, if you actually go back and listen to episodes 20 through 25, I was forcing myself to talk about a game that I just did not play anymore.
So that was kind of the straw, was when your wife said, "Hey, you're not having fun.
Exactly.
This is a game."
And then she also saw this cost going out the month, for hosting Podbean and hosting the website and hosting bandwidth charges. Yeah, that doesn't help out.
So you weren't around for the actual end of the show, but that was something that probably was a catalyst towards the show going off.
After I bowed out, I finished editing episode 25 and uploaded it, and then I started turning over everything directly to Brad. Like the control of the Twitter account and the Facebook page and all the various stuff that I had, because I was really the technical guy for the entire show. he decided that he wanted to relaunch the show to do a video show, and he would record it and then upload it directly to YouTube. So it was live for the people who were in the chat channel, but for everybody else, they just have to wait for YouTube. And then he even paid to have hosting to do video content on iTunes, like a double feed. And the video show, he put a ton of work into it, and it looked great, but there was just something off about the show, and it just never really caught on. And it started getting more and more sporadic, where he'd take 3 or 4 weeks off in between shows. And then I think he only did another 20 episodes, but it's like I came back to do, it was like a year later, I came back and they asked me to come back and just do like a guest host, return show. And when I looked on the iTunes feed, that's actually the last show in the feed. So, once again, I was sort of on the last show. I feel bad about that, but I realized he had a lot going on in his life. And then, of course, when I left, suddenly he was fully responsible for all of this stuff. And I just don't think he could keep up with the payments. And I mean, it was a lot of money for just a short hobby. And the biggest cost had to have been, the bandwidth just for the host, the game server. Now the game server is still up and the website is still up, but the actual, the podcast, the video and the audio they're just gone. So
now I was going to ask some questions about the finances, but it sounds like there was really two things that drove that show to the point where it was done, and it was the financial as well as the amount of work that was required to keep it going.
And passion too. I just lost the passion to do it.
Super important with podcasting, especially. Was there any point where you guys sat down and said, let's try and figure out some kind of financial plan? This was maybe before the passion was gone and you saw things were taking off. I know you said you felt weird about asking your community for money, but you also said that they were a really good and passionate community. So perhaps if they were asked, they would have come through. Does that ever cross your mind?
Looking back, I think we probably could have supported it. This was years before things like Patreon or even any of the other charity sites, and like PayPal. It just, like I said, it just felt weird asking, kids like send us some PayPal money if you like the show. And we definitely did talk about it. We realized that there was no way we can get any good hosting, sponsors, because we felt like we were just being bent over backwards just on the cost we were paying. So there's no way we were going to like recommend hosts, for like the gaming server. Mm-hmm. And I had so much technical problems with Podbean. I wanted to throw them out the window, but that's another thing aside. We'll get into Libsyn a little later. My love of Libsyn. Hopefully they're not one of your sponsors. I'm sorry.
Not now.
Ruin that one. I'm just a ruiner. We did talk about it, and as we started bringing more guest hosts into the show or into adminning the server and stuff, we thought about asking them to sort of chip in, but I don't know. Brad was very, I really don't want to say he was controlling, but like it really was his baby. It was his idea all the way, with the actual concept of This Week in Minecraft. And he really went out there and let me take the whole podcast idea, and I just ran with it. And it turned out fantastic for both of us. So when I sort of gave up on that dream, you could tell that he sort of reverted back to, well, I'll do it all myself kind of a mentality. And like I said, the video podcast, it was such an original idea. Like he built a fake studio using Minecraft blocks, and people would show up in game,
cool.
In the live audience. You could sit in the audience with your Minecraft avatar, and he would pan around with a fake camera. And it was fantastic, but it It's just, I think it's just the spark and the creativity of, the topics that keep people engaged just sort of wasn't there,
So after you left This Week in Minecraft, you started to tell a story about meeting Scott Viper. You had a chance to start from scratch here. You were into the podcasting part. You just kind of had lost your spark for Minecraft, and you didn't have the finances to continue. What is Late Night Steamer, and what kinds of things did you try and do differently from the very beginning to make sure you didn't run into these same problems again?
Well, let me give you a 2-minute summation of Scott Viper, just so it brings it up here. At the same time as I was about to leave This Week in Minecraft, I started networking with other shows that were, in the iTunes feed, because I'm like, oh, let's friend all these guys. It was great. We started having some of them on as guest hosts, and Scott Viper was one of them. And then, of course, we guest hosted on his show, which was at the time called Lethal Injection Minecraft Podcast, or LIMP, as they call it. So if you ever hear him refer to the Limpers, that's what that is about. His show was the complete opposite of ours. His was just, rude, crude humor. It was explicit. It was made for adults, and he was fantastic at it. And his show was hilarious, but he was working a show where his 2 guest hosts were consistently failing at showing up, and he was getting to the point where he was sick of talking about Minecraft, and he wanted to throw in the towel too. And that's when him and I started talking on the side. Be like, why don't we just do a show about gaming? And so that was literally, I think, the week that I had bought Skyrim on Steam. And I was like, Steam is fantastic. That was the first time I'd ever used Steam. And I'm like, why isn't people talking about this? And he's like, let's do a show about Steam. I'm like, yeah. And then so between the 2 of us, we started hatching out what we said was, our master plan for world domination, because we had both come from a background where we knew where we had both failed in our Minecraft podcast, and we knew what was expected to make a podcast and to make a community from nothing. So within, I think it was like 2 weeks, we had spun up everything. I mean, we're talking, we had done full PR campaigns to where we had Twitter accounts with, dozens of, dozens of followers that we were sending things out to people. We, of course, brought over a lot of the fans from our Minecraft podcast, and we sort of smushed them together, and that became our initial Late Night Steamer, fans. And that honestly was a blessing and a curse, because we brought these fans over, and then they started melding into this super fan group. And we had this false sense of, wow, we're actually doing this great, because we got this huge community right off the bat. But it ends up, it was just people that were following us over. They weren't like new listeners, so to speak. And between the 2 of us, we also brought over Linux for Life, who was one of the admins on the TWIM server. So there was 3 of us that ended up doing, we completely split up all of the costs, the hosting, the website fees, the URLs, all that stuff. And it really didn't seem too cost prohibitive when you split it 3 ways. And then we realized later that we wanted to have more hosts on, because we thought it was fun to sort of rotate ideas and have fresh voices. So we started adding, a 4th and a 5th chair into our shows. And when you start splitting the cost even further, cost wise, at the time, it didn't seem like much. It was later on down the line when our show, we sort of, I think, I never even got the full details of our actual download rates, but it seemed to me like at the peak of what I think our glory was in our show, that's when we started getting into very odd purchases where it made sense for our show, but I look back and I'm like, that was a terrible financial decision. One good example I could bring up is, we're a Steam podcast, so we're like, oh, we have to run a TF2 server, right? We have to run, we just have to. So we purchased a TF2 server, and we paid for monthly hosting, and nobody ever played on it. Even we never played on it. And the few times we tried to organize an event, we'd all go to log in and we're like, the server was outdated. We'd have to spend like a half an hour updating the software. Like, it was terrible. It was such a, we look back and I'm like, wow, we're paying, $15 to $20 a month for something that nobody's using, Late Night Steamer ended up going into, I think it was like episode 89. Much further than where Twimcast went, but I think one of the successes of that show was we had it like a revolving list of hosts, very much like you guys just automatically do on some of the like the Lotro Reporter, where you have like a handful of guests, or hosts that if one of them's out, the other five sort of pick up the slack, so to speak.
Yeah.
But the problem we started having was everybody that was on the show was, we were always referred to as blowhardy hosts. Like, we would talk over each other all the time. And there was a lot of like talking over and a lot of goofing around and,
Yeah, I will say I can go ahead and insert my Late Night Steamer experience here. I guest hosted on episode 85 called Amazon on Fire. And honestly, that was a fun time, and I guess I'm not too ashamed to say I'm a little surprised that I enjoyed it. And that's not a slight against you guys. It's just that if you know me, I have a certain way that I like to do my show. I like to do shows that are kid friendly, like you said before with your Minecraft show, so that I don't feel bad about my kids listening to what I'm involved in. I agreed to do Late Night Steamer because I knew you and I trusted you, but it was we got on there and. Yeah, there was a lot of that, you guys talking over each other and giving each other a hard time and goofing around. But I noticed you were very respectful when I started to say something. So guests got a little bit of special treatment on that show.
They did. That was another thing that we aimed to do from the beginning that we sort of half pulled off. We aimed to, since it was more of a show about gaming in general, but it was all Steam related, we started having guests on that were either... had popular shows of their own that had something to do with a game that's on Steam. So, we had various Lotro personalities on. We had American Golden Star, we had you, and etc. And we also started having, that was the first time in my life where I started reaching out to developers, specifically like indie developers, and trying to get them as guest hosts on. And I think we snagged like 4 or 5 of them in the end. That ended up being fantastic shows. And, we've sort of networked and made friends with a lot of these guys. And I look back at that as a huge success because, we actually landed some good interviews where we had people on. But the sad part was by the way we were running the show, which was half Steam news, half, inside jokes that were pretty crude in their nature. Suddenly we'd have an actual, like, legitimate indie developer on the show, and we all didn't know what to say. Like, those were, like, some of our most polite, straightforward episodes, and our live audience would just be silent. It was just like, it would go from, short of having, our live audience would be like a chat board for 4chan. Like, it's just terrible jokes floating through the chat channel. And then next thing you know, they're just silent when you have an actual human being on that they just want to sit there and listen to. I went through all that effort, personally to get these guys on the show, and a lot of the other hosts, and I really don't want to make this sound like I'm blaming them at all. A lot of the other hosts I felt they didn't help out enough as far as coming up with creative questions for, these guests on. So like, I felt like I did all this work to get them on the show, and then I just asked them about their game, and that was kind of the interview, And, the developer would get some publicity, and they'd have a good laugh because, it's for them, it was like, kick back, open up a beer and, laugh about our crude jokes. But that was also, and this sort of goes back to your whole topic of when is it no longer a hobby and suddenly you're a journalist? Like, we were skirting that line so hard because, we were asking these guys legitimate questions, but at the same time, we're like, remember, this is all off the record. This whole podcast is a joke. So, this is not official.
Well, it was really apparent that you had a good time doing it, but did you also see some warning signs similar to what you saw with This Week in Minecraft when you, financially or otherwise?
Yes. Scott was always pushing us to be more professional. And I will admit at the time when he said that, I would return with like a fart sound. Like my immaturity in my head was just like, I always looked at it like it was a hobby, whereas Scott was the only one in our group that definitively wanted to say, I want to do this as a living. And we started like befriending other people doing smaller shows or bigger shows. And those ended up being like, permanent hosts on our show. One of them was Andy from Geek Culture Happy Hour. That was a fantastic show. Unfortunately, it closed down too. We had Randark from Return of the Retro, who, their show is still actually live on iTunes, and they're recording episodes as, I think this week, actually. And then, of course, Linux for Life. When he left TWIM, he couldn't get rid of that itch for Minecraft, so he started his own show called Minecraft Uncensored, and you could use your imagination there. But everybody was doing their own shows for a hobby, but Scott kept pushing everybody like, no, we need to do less joking around and less, lollygagging and less horsing around, and he really kept pushing us more and more to be more professional and more straightforward. And every time, this is where, there's this huge rift that sort of formed in our podcasting group, was every time that we sort of did that, in my opinion, that's where we lost a lot of the spark. Our audience, our live audience, which is what we fed on, just got bored or left or didn't show up, because we had an itinerary and we were following it, and, we didn't stray from our little structured podcast.
Do you think that stemmed back to the original makeup of the audience when you brought the young crowd over
so.
From the Minecraft podcast to begin with?
The people that followed us, you could tell that they loved the live show where it was just chaotic and nobody knew what was going to happen. And, we had all sorts of stupid sound effects and things like that. And it really was just all over the place. And it was, when you look back, you're just like, man, maybe we were a little bit too zany, I guess would be the word. And it really appealed to that group. And so when we started falling into a routine structured show, we lost a lot of those listeners. They just disappeared. And, we still had our hardcore fans from back in the day. And even today, we still joke and back and forth on Twitter. But I really think that was, you're right. That's sort of when they sort of tuned out. That's when I saw that, okay, we're having creative differences, and every week seemed like it was an experiment, to see how far we could push it towards, this line. But when we're doing that, we're sort of sacrificing this,
It sounds like you were pretty in tune with what your audience was responding to. Do you feel like you were maybe trying to tailor the show to them too much, as opposed to doing the show that you enjoyed and letting your audience find you?
Our fantastic example of whether or not we were letting our guests sort of guide the show was when we did episode 50. I put a blank Google document out there. I gave everybody anonymous full write access to it, and we let our fans write the show word for word. And it was just one gigantic 2-hour long inside joke. And it was hilarious when you look back at the concept. But we were, at the time, we were like, we actually, we told them we're going to read it word for word. And like 10 minutes before the show started, I locked the document so nobody could make any changes. And to this day, I'm like, that was a fantastically bad idea, but it was so great at the time, because we let the fans write the show. And after that, that's when that sort of was around the time when Scott was like, okay, we really need to, episode 50 celebration aside, we really need to crack down and formalize our structure. And we had sections we took in and took out, and it became more or less like it seemed like we were taking on more of an editorial show after that. Up to that point, Steam was fantastic about having a set list of released games every week, and we could sit there and talk about all of them, and that would almost take up the entire hour. And after that episode sometime, that's when Steam really let open the floodgates, and it was ludicrous to try to keep up with the news of everything that was released on Steam at that point. So we sort of started picking topics, are consoles dead? That was a huge topic. Oh my God. Don't ever bring that up in a podcast. Edit that out. No,
we're not talking about that.
So no, we're not. I don't even remember what I said. So, we started choosing topics every week. So we would brush through the new release list. We'd just list off bullet points. Does anyone want to talk about any of these games? No. We'd move on. And we started being somewhat, I would almost say, hypocritical, because we started off as a news podcast about Steam. And then, after episode 50, we started saying, okay, there's so many games coming out that we're just going to list them as a bullet point, and we're not even going to talk about them. Or we'd talk about one game every week. But the one game we'd pull every week ended up being it would be like, okay, who wants to talk about a game? And between the 5 or 6 hosts, we would sit there and it'd be just dead silence. We had gotten to the point where we stopped making notes about the show. We would just show up and record an hour of show from the hip, and there was no planning, and it just got sloppy, and it was great.
Do you attribute that to loss of passion for the show as well, or was this just something totally different where you weren't on the same page, so it wasn't even really worth doing it anymore?
I know that a lot of my passion sort of waned when we really started pushing more and more for a video only format. And then there was an accident, is what I was told, where Libsyn had lost all of our shows. Like our Libsyn account just disappeared suddenly. And as a result, our iTunes audio feed was just gone. And that's when we were trying to push more and more to doing video only. And Scott was really heavy into going that route. So it sort of worked out for, his argument, hey, we should be a video only podcast. And so we started doing streaming to Twitch, and then eventually we switched over to Google Hangouts. And I think that's really when we were just like an audio podcast, sure, we were streaming to Twitch, but it was like we were just showing static graphics or something, or, looping videos that we were talking about the games. So we'd have the trailer playing. And it suddenly became more of a technical hassle to sort of, you had to spend a lot of time building the video content to keep the show, to keep the audience entertained. And then, of course, you had to keep in mind that it was like going to be a YouTube show eventually. And when we went from an iTunes audio cast to a YouTube only show, that is when I know Scott really pushed hard that we all need to sort of clean up our act and sort of hammer down. And I don't hold a grudge against him for that. But at the same point, personally, that's when I thought, from my standpoint at least, that's when it stopped being fun.
Well, losing your entire audio feed is not a small deal when you have, I don't know, however many 70 episodes, 60 episodes that you had at that point. Did you feel like you lost a lot of your audience when that happened? Because I know, I'm speaking from an old man's perspective here. I don't gravitate towards podcasts on YouTube or in video format. I gravitate towards something I can stick in my ear while I'm doing something else. So I'm just wondering if that really affected your numbers from a downloads perspective.
I honestly, like, when I listen to Lotro Reporter, I listen to it while I'm driving. I would never. I love you guys to death, but I don't think I'd ever show up for like a live show. Just because the thought of I still haven't completely bought into the whole, Twitch streaming. Like, I see how people are just crazy over their head about watching like Dota championships and that, but oh my God, I just can't watch live streaming that much. But so when I put that into my head about, but here we are doing a live show that's only video, it depressed me. And I even toyed with the idea of ripping the audio from our YouTube feed and just starting another audio only iTunes feed. But at that point I wouldn't say we were arguing about cost, but we were all very sensitive to the cost of the show because all of us in our lives, our personal lives, were sort of getting in the way, where like one of our hosts was going off into the military for her Army Reserve duties all the time. One of us sort of disappeared into a rehab, clinic. One of us had lost their jobs, and then one of us was sort of building up our career. And then, it was a whole series of bad luck, I would say, where just real life got in the way. So when you started talking about, should I just go out on my own and sort of make this audio feed back again? I was just like, I just didn't. I probably could afford it, but at the same time, I just didn't want to pay for it, Yeah.
So what was the absolute final straw for Late Night Steamer as far as you're concerned?
We went, I know personally, I missed, I think it was like 4 or 5 weeks in a row for the show where, I had to pull out at the last minute because at the time my job was actually taking a lot more of my personal time during the week, and we were always a weekend show. We were always on Saturday night at 11 p.m. And then my wife was off those nights, so that was like the only night I could hang out with her, and I felt guilty saying, I know I haven't seen you all week, but I'm going to go talk to a bunch of guys about video games that I don't play. So
that is a hard one to explain away.
So I would, I started bowing out from the show weeks and weeks in a row to hang out with my wife. And also at that time, I had also realized that I had become like a Steamaholic. And my God, if you ever want to talk about a game where people just hoard video games, or if you ever want to do a show about hoarding video games, please, dear God, have me on, because I went from one game to I'm like over 500, I think, now on Steam. Like, I've recreated almost every game that I've ever wanted in Steam. Like, I now own them all, And I realized how much money I was just spending on Steam because I felt obligated to buy these games and try to play them because I'm like, hey, I'm running a Steam podcast. I got to have a lot of Steam games, right? So I hit this point where I'm like, I need to stop buying games. So I just stopped. And that was also when I went from a VIP subscription on Lotro to my infamous free-to-play where I bought everything I wanted to play. And I have been playing Lotro now for a year and a half since that day. And I haven't paid a cent. And I love it. Mm-hmm. So, between missing the shows and not buying games, and I'm also on a show where I'm supposed to talk about games, and every week all I'm saying is, this is a great game, I'm going to put it on my wish list, but I don't think I'd pay full price. That was my standard answer for everything. And it just, they jokingly, they called me out on that. And they're like, what are your thoughts? DJ? Well, yes, we already know you're not going to buy it, So, in the end, during the weeks that I was gone, some of the other guys had some, personal issues, and they had to sort of bow down from the show. And I don't fault them for that at all. But it came down to Scott was getting to the point where he was sort of with his Minecraft podcast, where he sort of felt like he was doing it by himself. And he sent an email to all of us, and he said, listen, I'm going to do this next show, and then that'll be the last one, and I'm out because, I just don't. He basically correctly called us out. He's like, I think the passion is gone. We never really did get professional, and I don't blame. All of his points were very valid, and he said, I'll let you guys, you could have the show, do whatever you want. And then suddenly the other hosts I sensed that they sort of looked at me for a reaction, because every time there was like a major deciding force to sort of guide the show, it really came down to, I hate to use this illusion, like him and I were like mommy and daddy, it was just like we could never get along, and everybody was looking at one of us for an answer, and I sensed that, once he was gone, I don't know if I had enough time to actually keep the show going. But if I did, it would be like a major overhaul. It would sort of be back to where I thought my vision should have, taken over. But, like I said, we were trying to be democratic about the whole process to figure out which direction we wanted to take everything. And I knew that I didn't want to just radically change it and take a gamble. And financially, I'm just like, I was so done just spending money for something on a huge a hobby. So I ended up, I sent an email out to the group, right after that, I told Scott that I understood his position and all that, and wished him well and whatever he does in the future. And then I told them, I was like, that'll be our last show.
So this week in Minecraft, financial constraints was a problem. Amount of work was a problem.
Definitely.
Possibly both leading to burnout or loss of passion, or maybe just the longevity of it. Late night steamer, finances, kind of a problem, kind of not. Creative differences leading to loss of passion.
Yeah.
Amount of work. You look at the reasons that these two things fizzled out, and in hindsight, how do you feel now looking back and seeing that history kind of repeated itself, despite the fact that you were able to start Late Night Steamer from scratch, knowing everything that you knew from This Week in Minecraft?
You're right. It's ironic that history does repeat itself, and I think our biggest lesson that I could learn from Late Night Steamer is I think some of our biggest internal arguments, if you want to call them that, all revolved around whether or not we wanted to really try to make it a business or not. And that's where that was the big difference that we could never solve. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And if anybody's ever thinking about making a gaming community, please keep that in mind with your partners. It's like, when you get to that point, do you want to just go all out and make it an actual gaming profession almost versus just a stupid side hobby, And it's funny when I look at other shows that have stopped, I've seen some similarities, and I don't know, it's the unspoken questions, I guess.
It sounds like there was potentially, I don't know if I want to say lack of vision, because that sounds really negative, but I'm not sure that, for one thing, if you don't know whether you're going to eventually make the step and turn your hobby into a business, I guess you could argue that you weren't looking far enough ahead, or you just didn't expect it to get to that point. Do you think that's possibly the case?
I believe so. I mean, like, and like I said, I'm speaking from the standpoint of this was always a hobby for me. When we started the show, I was excited that we had an instant audience, and I sort of look back at that as that was, you know, it was almost like a drug, you know, like it was exciting and it was great to sort of feed off that vibe. But then when we sort of fell down into the routine and started making the actual show, that's when it really ground on me. So, because those people just sort of faded away.
So at this point, do you feel that there's a solution for the hobbyist who's striving to both build an audience and to keep it affordable and maintainable and continue to grow the community? I guess the reason I'm asking that is, what can the rest of us take away from your two experiences here?
Well, the thing that we were very successful about with Late Night Steamer was we launched it perfectly from a technical standpoint. But like you had mentioned, we did not have a clear vision, and we sort of floated along from place to place, and creative differences between, you know, the hosts literally came down to arguments where, I mean, it was almost like, you know, they say in business, if you're going to form an actual partnership, you got to really make sure you two are on the same page. And that sort of mentality tore us apart internally. And our goals and our visions were so wildly different that when you see your audience slipping away, we kept making radical changes. And I think some of that sort of didn't help as well. Try to make subtle changes to your format, you know, and I almost don't want to say market test it, but make sure you have stuff in place to get good feedback. And another thing that really, really helps out with new, you know, community builders is the social media aspect of it. Be completely open to everybody, because you would not believe the friends and networking you will make in the process.
As far as what I've been up to this past month, I'm going to kind of breeze through the blog post pretty quickly, because I do have a few things I want to say towards the end of this section. Started off this month with a post called Totally Unfair Rankings of My Top MMOs. And the thing that's unfair is that I haven't played all the MMOs, and also some of the ones that I ranked were still in beta phase. So if you want to see how I rank my top MMOs, go ahead and click through on that. Spoiler alert, Lord of the Rings Online is number 1. Another post I did was called The Move Back to Simplicity, which ponders some of the industry movement towards simplification of games, even MMOs, and why that's happening and where I think that might be going. I did a quick little post, kind of a funny post called A Backer Story, which kind of, the idea was to parallel that scene in the movie A Christmas Story, where the little boy Ralphie gets his much anticipated secret decoder pin and rushes off to figure out only that the whole reason that the decoder pin was mailed to him in the first place was so they could continue to advertise to him. I had the kind of a similar feeling when I got an email from Robert Space Industries this past month about being accepted into the Arena Commander module of Star Citizen. Next post was called To Sleep Perchance to Stream, and it talks about my first real try to do live streaming while gaming. I used a service called Hitbox. I know a lot of people use Twitch, but I figured I'd go ahead and try Hitbox, since some people are a little bit wary about what's going to happen with this whole Google-Twitch merger that's possibly going to happen. My latest post is called My Children's Hospital Experience and Extra Life Decision, and this is one of the most personal posts I've ever done on my blog, and it talks about an experience I had about 10 years ago with one of my sons who got very sick, and we had to take him to a specialized hospital nearby. And speaking of which, I'd like to take this opportunity to announce my participation in this year's Extra Life Gaming Marathon. Extra Life is a charity that supports Children's Miracle Network hospitals around the U.S., and this marathon is for gamers who want to raise money for that cause. They do so by getting donations to play a 24-hour gaming marathon on October 25th. If you read my previously mentioned post, you'll know that the cause, along with the St. Louis Children's Hospital, hold a special place for me, personally, and I'd love to put your donations to good use. So if you'd like to help out, please go to extralife.org/participant/Braxwolf and click on the Support Me button to choose the amount you wish to donate. Every little bit helps. I've never asked for money for this podcast or for my blog before, so I guess I'm asking now. If you've ever enjoyed anything I've written or put out as a podcast, please go over there and help out. As a thank you to those who donate, raffle prizes will be unlocked as we progress towards my $500 goal. Anybody who donates and leaves contact information, obviously it's tough to do when you're anonymous, will be automatically enrolled in the raffle. The prizes will be in the form of Steam games for simplicity's sake, so you'll need that platform in order to redeem the prize. And will be unlocked at every $100 milestone. Currently, we're halfway to unlocking the first prize. There will also be a prize for the largest single donation. So keep an eye on Braxwolf.com for more raffle information, as well as for donation progress updates. Probably one of the most exciting things to happen to me this month was that I was featured on Massively.com, which you probably know is one of the bigger gaming MMO sites out there. I was featured in a list, actually, of a dozen MMO podcasts you should check out. This was a very, very good list. There were several podcasts on the list that I'm familiar with and the podcasters that I know pretty well from the Newbie Blogger Initiative and from Twitter and from other places on the net. I would encourage you to go to the show notes and click on that story, because if you like Beyond Boss Fights, there's probably several other podcasts on that list that are going to be interesting to you. I realize that there may be some folks here listening that found this show through that Massively article, and if you're listening for the first time, thank you and welcome. Make sure you leave me some feedback to let me know what you think. We'll go ahead and go into feedback now. I do have a couple pieces of feedback to talk about. Very happy to hear from Randolph once again. I haven't heard from you in a few episodes, Randolph. He writes, "Great show, Mighty Braxwolf." I'll leave that up to individual listeners if they think I'm mighty or not. The topic you explored this week is an important one. He's referring to the Gamers and Health episode from last month. And one that most gamers need to hear more about, myself included. Thank you very much for the food for thought. It was a full meal indeed. I enjoyed listening to Carrie and Sig as well. They both contributed nicely to the conversation. Not really sure. Well, first of all, I will comment on that. Yes, Carrie and Sig were fantastic. I'm learning very quickly that the quality of each show depends greatly on the quality of the guest, and I think both of them showed that they were excellent guests for that particular topic. I'm not really sure how you see things from your end, but from where I sit, Beyond Boss Fights feels like a labor of love. Kind of goes with what we were talking about tonight. The consistent quality and thought-provoking conversations are a real pleasure to listen to. I sincerely hope you continue to put these out for years to come. Best wishes and take care, Randolph. So thank you, Randolph. I've been very blessed with feedback, really, since I started this podcast. If I look at my statistics and the amount of feedback that I've gotten, it's a pretty good percentage compared to what a lot of more popular podcasts get. So thank you for keeping that coming in. That really I don't know, puts gas in your tank as a content creator, don't you think, DJ?
Oh, definitely. And I have to agree with Randolph. That was a fantastic show. Not to give some more live feedback, but my wife and I listened to that show, and she hates gaming podcasts. We listened to that while we were driving to North Carolina, and she loved the show.
Awesome.
You won my wife over. And when I told her I was podcasting tonight, she's like, "Was it with that fitness guy that you were listening?" I was like, "Yeah." She was actually like, "Good job."
I'm far from a fitness guy, but thank you. My other piece of feedback I wanted to share tonight was from iTunes, the UK version. titled A Great Podcast for Gamers from Sean XXP. I'm a big fan of this podcast as it offers a lot of very interesting perspectives on some of the wider issues around gaming and MMORPGs too. It's well edited and with great sound quality. Would definitely recommend. Thank you, Sean, for your feedback. I had to chuckle a little bit when I saw this because it came in right after the episode that I released last month where I had a huge editing snafu right at the end and forgot to add the music that I was going to in the feedback section. I know it's a cardinal sin to point out your own mistakes, but I figure it's a month later, so, people have forgotten by now. But thank you again, Sean. I do appreciate the feedback. Andrew, thank you so much for being with me. This has been a really outstanding conversation. I hope that you get back into community building at some point, and I hope that folks that have listened can take some of these lessons at least, and perhaps if they're interested in getting into some community building or content creation, think about it up front, lay out some kind of a plan. I mean, I know it's hard to do these goals and 5-year plans and things that people ask you to do at work, but when it comes right down to it, it really does help to have some kind of an idea where you want to go. And as you've kind of proven, working with others, you got to be on the same page with that vision as well, because eventually at some point it's going to come to a head. I'm not saying that anything you did was wrong. Obviously, we're all kind of learning this as we go, but sometimes a little bit of insight into other people's lessons learned can help you out down the line.
Yeah, and even with my contact information you probably give out, I still always see myself as not as a pioneer, but more as if you need help on what not to do, always reach out to me. I'm always I love helping people with the technical side of it, which we can master. But as far as the other stuff, I could tell you pitfalls left and right. So I thought that's why it was a fantastic idea to do a show about this. So I thank you for having me on.
You can send your feedback to braxwolf@gmail.com and I'll read it on the podcast. Remember that Beyond Boss Fights is on iTunes, and we would appreciate your ratings and reviews. Beyond Boss Fights is also on Stitcher, so please add it to your playlists. And actually, I'm going to let you give out your own contact information. It's kind of a tradition here so that I don't mess it up.
My Twitter is DJPimpDaddy, the one and only. And then, of course, I have my gaming blog website where you can find everything is DJPimpDaddy.com. And then I had a side project I was starting a year ago that I haven't done much with called ITGuyDown.com. It's going to be after talking with you before the show, I think I really need to push to get that going. And that really is more of a nod out to Dodge Howl. So we'll see more from that in the future.
The next time I have you on, I'm going to ask you for an update on it. So just be ready. Okay.
Challenge accepted. As long as I don't have to dump ice water all over my head or something.
And as for me, you can follow me on Twitter @Braxwolf, BRAXWOLF. You can email me at braxwolf@gmail.com. I'm on Facebook, facebook.com/Braxwolf. Got a YouTube channel, youtube.com/user/Braxwolf. And of course, my blog is at braxwolf.com. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for listening, Boss Fighters. We'll see you next time.